The morning my daughter called from the hospital, I was standing in my kitchen trying to remember if I'd eaten breakfast. That's what getting old does to you. You forget the small things first. Breakfast. Where you left your reading glasses. Whether you took your blood pressure pill. My wife used to keep track of all of it. After Eleanor passed 4 years ago this past March, I had to start keeping a notepad on the counter just to remind myself of the basics. So there I was, 67 years old, standing in my kitchen in Dayton, Ohio, in the same flannel shirt I'd worn 2 days in a row, looking at a half-empty coffee pot, when my phone rang. It was my daughter, Cora. Dad. Her voice had that careful, controlled quality she uses when she's trying not to alarm me. She's a pediatric nurse. She learned to talk like that at work. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I told her, of course. She was my daughter. I'd always been honest with her. Keith told me last night that he's been dropping off money at your house. Every month. He said you two worked out an arrangement, that he gives you $600 in cash, first of the month, to help with utilities and groceries. She paused. Dad, has he been doing that? I set my coffee mug down on the counter. I had to set it down because my hand had started to shake. Keith is my son-in-law. He and Cora have been married 11 years. They live about 20 minutes from me, out in Beaver Creek, in a house Cora's income mostly pays for. Keith sells commercial real estate, has a good enough living, drives a decent truck, wears the right kind of watch. We'd never been close the way some fathers and sons-in-law become close. But I'd never had any real reason to distrust him either. No, I said. Cora, he has never given me a single dollar. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Dad, she finally said very quietly, how long has this been going on? That was the question, wasn't it? I didn't know the answer yet, but I was about to find out. And what I found would unravel nearly 2 years of my life in ways I still have trouble putting into words. Let me go back to the beginning. Back to when it all started without me even knowing it had started. Eleanor and I had been married 41 years when she got her diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer. By the time they caught it, there wasn't much to be done. We had 11 months from diagnosis to the morning I held her hand in the hospice room and felt it go still. I won't talk about those 11 months in detail. Some things aren't for sharing. What I will say is that Eleanor handled it with more grace than I ever could have managed in her position, and that losing her left a hole in my life that I have spent 4 years learning to carry rather than fill. I retired from the post office after 33 years. I have my pension, Social Security, and a modest savings account that Eleanor and I built carefully over 4 decades of being careful people. We never lived extravagantly. We took one real vacation, Yellowstone, the summer Cora turned 12. We drove a reliable car until it stopped being reliable. We paid off the house in 2019. When Eleanor died, I was left with no mortgage, manageable health costs through Medicare, and enough to be genuinely okay without being wealthy. Cora worried about me. That's who she is. She started coming by more often after the funeral, bringing food, sitting with me on the back porch. I appreciated it. I also noticed, around 8 or 9 months after Eleanor passed, that Keith had started coming along more than he used to. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought it was Cora's doing, her way of pulling us closer together in the aftermath of grief. Then, about 18 months ago, Keith came by alone one afternoon. Cora was working a double shift. He said he was just checking in. He seemed distracted, kept glancing at his phone. But he sat at my kitchen table and drank a cup of coffee, and we talked about the Bengals for a while. Before he left, he asked me, almost casually, the way you ask about the weather, whether I'd considered doing a will update since Eleanor passed. I told him I had a will, done years ago with a lawyer downtown. He nodded slowly, said that things might need updating, that assets get complicated for older folks living alone, that he knew a financial planner who could look things over for free, as a favor. I thanked him and said I'd think about it. I didn't think much about it after he left, but now, sitting here after Cora's phone call, I pulled that memory out of storage and looked at it differently. I'd always been a patient man. 33 years sorting mail teaches you to keep your head down and work methodically. I picked up my notepad from the counter and I wrote down, Keith, coffee, will, financial planner. Then I drew a line underneath it and started trying to remember everything else. There was the time, maybe 2 months after that visit, when Keith helped me set up online banking. My old bank had switched systems and I'd been slow to adapt. He came over, sat at my desk, walked me through it patiently, set up my login, showed me how to check my balance and download statements. Very helpful. I thanked him sincerely. There was the afternoon he helped me deal with what he called a confusing billing error with my homeowner's insurance. He made a few calls on my behalf, sorted it out, said it was nothing, don't worry about it. There was the Sunday he drove me to get my car's inspection done, waited with me for 2 hours, wouldn't hear of me paying for his time. Individually, these were acts of a decent son-in-law becoming a more present figure in a widower's life. Collectively, looking at them on my notepad that morning, they formed a different shape entirely. I called my neighbor Frank, who is a retired accountant and sharper than most people half his age. I asked if he had time to sit with me. He came over within the hour, and I laid it all out for him. Cora's call, Keith's visits, the online banking setup, all of it. Frank listened without interrupting. He had his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead the whole time, which is what he does when he's thinking hard. "Have you logged into your bank account recently?" he asked. I hadn't. Not since Keith set it up. I'd been getting paper statements mailed to the house, and those had looked normal enough that I hadn't paid close attention. Frank and I sat down at my computer. I pulled up the account, and then I sat very still for a long time. There were transfers I hadn't made. Not large ones. Nothing that would have set off alarms in my head, even if I'd been watching more carefully. 200 here, 350 there. 11 times over the past 16 months. Always made on a weekday morning, usually a Tuesday or Wednesday. The recipient listed was something called Bridgeway Property Solutions, LLC. I had no idea what Bridgeway Property Solutions was. Frank wrote every transaction down. He totaled them up while I made more coffee. When I came back with the mugs, he slid the notepad toward me without saying anything. $4,280. I sat down. "You didn't authorize any of this," Frank said. It wasn't really a question. "I've never heard of Bridgeway Property Solutions in my life," I said. Frank tapped his pen against the table. "Keith is in commercial real estate." We looked at each other. I want to be careful here because I am not a man who jumps to conclusions. I spent 33 years in a job where you learn to check, double-check, and then check again before you blamed anyone for a missing package. So I did not call Cora back that day. I did not call Keith. What I did was drive downtown to the bank the next morning and speak to the branch manager in person. Her name was Diane, and she had been managing that branch for 6 years. She knew me by name, which helped. I explained the situation calmly and asked 2 things. First, whether someone else could have had access to my account to initiate these transfers, and second, what I would need to do to find out. Diane took it seriously. She pulled up my account history, and together we found something I hadn't seen in the online view. A secondary profile had been added to my account. Not a joint owner. A third-party authorized user added 18 months ago with the ability to initiate transfers up to $500 without requiring my direct approval. I asked Diane who had been added. She showed me the form. It had my signature on it. I stared at my signature for a long time. Then I stared at the date. It was dated the same week Keith had sat at my desk and helped me set up online banking. I don't know exactly what I felt in that moment. Rage is too simple a word. Grief comes closer. The particular grief of realizing that someone looked at your loneliness and your trust and decided it was useful to them. I asked Diane to remove the authorized user immediately and to flag the account. She advised me to file a police report and consult an attorney. I told her I intended to. I want to explain why I didn't tell Cora right away. People ask me that. The reason is simple and complicated at the same time. Cora loves Keith. 11 years of marriage. They don't have children yet, but they've been trying. She's 38, and I know from things she doesn't say directly that this has been hard for her. I could not walk into that situation with an accusation I wasn't fully prepared to prove. If I told her what I suspected, and I was wrong, or if I told her before I had documentation, I could destroy her marriage and my relationship with her in one phone call. I needed to be certain. So I went to see an attorney named Douglas Webb, whose office was on Salem Avenue, and whose name I'd found through the Ohio State Bar's referral service. I laid out everything I had. He listened, asked precise questions, and told me I had enough to start an investigation, but I should gather more before approaching law enforcement. Over the next 3 weeks, I did exactly that. I requested paper records from the bank going back 2 years. I asked Diane to help me identify every transaction that had been initiated by the authorized user. I wrote down a timeline. I drove past the address listed for Bridgeway Property Solutions on the Ohio Secretary of State Business Registry. It was a UPS store on Wilmington Pike, a registered agent address, the kind used for shell companies. Then I did something I'm not entirely proud of, but that I believe was necessary. I called Keith and told him my water heater was making a sound I was worried about, and asked if he could come take a look. He came the following Saturday morning, cheerful as always, and while he was in the basement, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone propped against the fruit bowl and recorded the conversation. I wasn't looking for a confession. I was looking for a pattern. And I got one. Over the course of 20 minutes of small talk, he referenced knowing my account balance within a few $100s. He mentioned, unprompted, that my finances looked stable. He asked whether I'd thought any more about that financial planner he'd mentioned. Each thing alone was nothing. Together on a recording that I then brought to Douglas Webb, they formed a picture. "You have enough," Douglas said. We went to the Dayton Police Department together. I filed a report. The detective assigned to the case was a methodical young woman named Specialist Carver, and she asked good questions. When I showed her the bank records and explained the authorized user's signature, she asked me directly whether I believed my signature had been forged. I told her I believed it had been added to a document I thought I was signing for something else, that during the online banking setup, Keith had likely had me sign something I hadn't fully read. I was 66 years old, I was grieving, and I trusted him. That's what I told her. I wasn't ashamed to say it plainly. Specialist Carver told me to go home and not contact Keith or discuss the investigation with anyone except my attorney. She said it with the quiet authority of someone who has seen cases fall apart because a victim confronted a suspect too early. I went home. I sat on the back porch where Eleanor and I used to drink our evening coffee. The yard needed mowing. The rose bush she'd planted the year we moved in needed trimming. I thought about her, about what she would have made of all of this. She had been a better judge of character than I was. She had been politely cool toward Keith in ways I'd chalked up to mother-hen instinct. I wondered now if she'd sensed something. Specialist Carver moved quickly once she had the bank records subpoenaed. What she found was worse than I'd expected. Bridgeway Property Solutions, LLC, had been incorporated by Keith 14 months ago. The company had 3 clients listed in its records. One of them was listed by a name very close to mine. A one-letter difference in my first name that could look like a typo but functioned as plausible deniability. The funds that had been transferred from my account had been run through Bridgeway and then applied toward the down payment on a commercial property in Miamisburg that Keith was in the process of purchasing under a separate LLC. He wasn't just stealing from me to cover gambling debts or personal expenses, the way I had assumed. He was stealing from me to build an asset, to use my retirement savings, dollar by dollar, to start building his own real estate portfolio. The total, once the forensic accountant Specialist Carver brought in finished going through everything, was $4,280 directly withdrawn, plus an additional $1.09 in a service fee Keith had billed to my homeowner's insurance claim, the one he'd helpfully resolved for me, that had been redirected to Bridgeway rather than applied to my premium. $6,240. I want to be very precise about that number, because several people told me it wasn't that much money in the grand scheme of things. Maybe not, but it was money that Eleanor and I had saved by not buying new furniture when the old furniture still worked, by driving a 2014 Camry until the odometer hit 190,000, by bringing our lunch to work every day for 3 decades. That money had a weight and a history that I don't think anyone who didn't live my life could fully calculate. There's something else I need to tell, the part that still keeps me up some nights. About 3 months before Cora's phone call, I'd had a bad stretch. Fatigue, stomach issues, a general fogginess that I'd chalked up to stress and age. My primary care doctor ran blood panels and found my kidney function slightly elevated. He attributed it to possible dehydration and told me to drink more water. I followed his instructions and things gradually improved. After the investigation began, Specialist Carver asked me, almost as a procedural afterthought, whether I'd had any unexplained health issues in the past year. I told her about the kidney episode. She made a note. 2 weeks later, she came to see me at home and told me they had found, in Keith's search history and in a notes application on his phone, research about substances that cause gastrointestinal distress and kidney stress, without leaving obvious markers in standard blood panels. The searches were dated 4 months before my health declined. She told me this information was being evaluated, but that she could not tell me more while the investigation was active. She told me she wanted me to speak with my doctor again and request a more comprehensive tox screen of samples they collected during my illness. I drove to my doctor's office the next morning and sat in the waiting room for an hour to see him without an appointment. He listened. He ordered the additional testing. The results were not definitive. The timeline was too long, the samples too degraded to produce certainty. But the doctor told me, quietly and carefully, that the pattern of my symptoms was consistent with low-dose, repeated exposure to something my body had been working to filter out. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time after that appointment. I had thought of Keith as someone who had taken advantage of a grieving old man's trust, a thief, which was bad enough. But sitting in that parking lot, I began to understand that the man who had sat at my kitchen table drinking my coffee and talking about the Bengals may have been testing something else entirely. Patience, maybe, or the limits of what he could take from me before I became inconvenient. I will not speculate further on what he intended. I will only tell you what I know. The police arrested Keith on a Thursday afternoon. Cora was at work. He was charged with elder financial exploitation, identity fraud, and unauthorized use of financial accounts. The additional health-related investigation was listed separately as ongoing. His attorney negotiated aggressively. I was told not to expect a dramatic courtroom conclusion. What happened instead was this. Keith entered a plea agreement 4 months after his arrest. He was required to make full restitution of the $60,240, plus the $2,100 in legal and investigative costs I'd incurred. He was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent prohibition from serving in any financial capacity for a family member or elder adult. He was also required to complete a financial exploitation offender program administered through the Montgomery County court system. No jail time. I won't pretend that didn't sting. The detective explained to me that first offense elder financial crimes in Ohio rarely result in incarceration, unless the amounts are substantially larger or violence is definitively proven. I nodded and thanked her for her work. She had done her job thoroughly and professionally, and it wasn't her failure that the law has the shape it has. The harder thing was Cora. I had told her everything the same night Keith was arrested, called her from the parking lot of the police station, and drove to her house and sat with her at her kitchen table for 3 hours. She cried. Not the soft, private kind of crying. The kind that comes from somewhere deeper than tears. The kind that sounds like something tearing loose. She kept saying she hadn't known. I believe her. I have always believed her. There was nothing in her behavior over those 16 months that suggested she was complicit, and everything in her face that night in her kitchen told me she was discovering the dimensions of who she'd married in real time, just like I had. She filed for divorce 6 weeks after the arrest. I won't speak much about those months for her. They were hers to carry, and she has carried them with more strength than I could have at her age. What I will say is that we grew closer in ways I didn't expect. She started coming by on Sundays again. We started watching old movies together. The ones I used to watch with Eleanor, which Cora had always been too busy for before. It turned out she knew more about those old films than I'd realized. She got it from her mother, she said. She just never had the time to show it. I got my money back, every dollar, as part of the restitution schedule. I didn't put it back into savings. I spent some of it on a proper security system for the house, the kind with cameras and remote monitoring that Frank helped me set up. I used some of it to finally have the rosebush properly tended by a landscaper who knew what they were doing. and I used the rest to make a donation to a nonprofit in Dayton called Eldercare Advocates, which provides free legal consultation to adults over 60 who suspect financial abuse but don't have resources to hire an attorney. The woman who runs the organization asked me if I'd be willing to speak at one of their community events. I said yes, though I'm not much of a public speaker. I stood in a church fellowship hall on a Tuesday evening in October, in front of about 40 people who were mostly my age or older, and I told them what had happened to me. Not all of it. Just enough. I told them that the people most likely to steal from you are the ones who know you trust them. I told them that grief makes you vulnerable in ways you don't fully understand while it's happening. It narrows your attention, dulls your skepticism, makes you grateful for any help that's offered. I told them that I had been a careful man my whole life, a man who read the fine print and kept receipts and balanced his checkbook every month, and that none of it had fully protected me when someone decided to sit at my table and look like family. I told them to ask questions, to log into their own bank accounts, to read every document before they sign it, no matter who's asking them to sign, no matter how much they trust that person, to name an independent person, not a family member, who can review their finances annually, and to never be ashamed of what happened to them. Because shame is what predators count on. They count on you being too embarrassed to tell anyone, too afraid of causing trouble, too worried about what people will think. One woman came up to me after, small and gray-haired, holding a cup of decaf in both hands. She said her son-in-law had been borrowing from her for 2 years, and she'd never told anyone because she didn't want to upset her daughter. I gave her Douglas Webb's card. I drive past that UPS store on Wilmington Pike sometimes, the one listed as the registered address for Bridgeway Property Solutions, the company Keith built with my money. It's an ordinary storefront between a nail salon and a sandwich shop, nothing to look at. But I look at it anyway, every time I pass, because I think it's important not to look away from the things that happened to you. Eleanor would have found the whole thing incomprehensible, I think. Not that someone had stolen from us. She understood that people were capable of that. What she would have found incomprehensible is that I hadn't seen it sooner. She would have said it kindly, but she would have said it. She was right about most things. I try to remember that, on the mornings when I stand in my kitchen with my coffee and my notepad, being more careful than I used to be. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, not obsessively. I'm past that stage, but the kind of quiet thinking you do when you're sitting on a back porch at dusk, watching the light go out of the sky, and the day gives you just enough stillness to be honest with yourself. What Keith did was a choice. Every transfer, every document he slid in front of me, every cup of coffee he drank at my table while knowing what he was doing. Those were choices. He didn't stumble into it. He planned it, and the planning is what I keep coming back to, because it tells you something important about how betrayal actually works. It doesn't usually arrive loudly. It arrives quietly, wearing a helpful face, asking if you'd like it to take a look at that paperwork for you. I was not a careless man. I want to be clear about that, not to defend myself, but because I think it matters. Carelessness isn't what makes people vulnerable to this kind of thing. Grief does. Trust does. The particular exhaustion of being older and alone and grateful when someone shows up and seems to give a damn. Those are human conditions, not character flaws. And anyone who tells you they couldn't be taken advantage of under the right circumstances hasn't been tested under those circumstances yet. What I learned, and I mean learned the way you learn things that cost you something, is that intelligence alone doesn't protect you. I'm not a stupid man. I read. I balanced my own books for decades. I caught errors that younger, faster people missed. None of it was enough because the person sitting across from me was counting on something that had nothing to do with my intelligence. He was counting on my love for my daughter. He was counting on the fact that I would never want to cause her pain by questioning her husband without being absolutely certain. He found the one place I'd lowered my guard, and he walked straight through it. That's the part I'd want anyone listening to carry with them. Not suspicion, not the impulse to wall yourself off from everyone who tries to help you, but the understanding that the people who mean to take from you have already thought carefully about what you're least likely to protect. They've already found the door you left unlocked because you trusted them with the key. Cora is doing better now. She's the one who asked the question that started all of this, and I think she'll spend a long time reckoning with the fact that she was living alongside something she couldn't see. That's not her fault either. Love is not a surveillance system. It was never supposed to be. Frank told me, the afternoon we sat at my computer and found those transfers, that the best thing I could do was stay methodical. Don't react. Document everything. Let the facts speak in the right room at the right time. He was right. The anger I felt in that bank office staring at my own signature on a form I didn't remember signing. I didn't let it move me faster than I should have moved. I let it make me precise instead. That discipline is the only thing I have to thank myself for in this whole situation. The rosebush Eleanor planted is looking better this year. The landscaper who came out in the fall knew what he was doing. Some things, with the right attention at the right time, come back.